Welcome to Inside Israel, everyone. I'm Joel Chasnoff coming to you from Ra'anana. And today is one of those somber episodes, which is why there was no music at the beginning if you're listening on Apple or Spotify. I'm recording this on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, and a number of people actually wrote in to ask, would there be a live recording given that I record on Sundays and this Sunday happened to be the 9th of Av? And I actually feel like there's no more appropriate day to record an episode about everything happening in Israel right now. And to explain what I mean, I'll give you a little bit of background on what the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av, is. I've always known it was a day of mourning because both of the temples were destroyed on the 9th of Av, but I also knew that other things happened. I wasn't sure exactly what, and so I looked it up. And just to share with you, it turns out that, yes, the Spanish Inquisition began on the 9th of Av in 1492. Jews were banned from England on the 9th of Av in 1290, and the deportation of the Warsaw Ghetto officially began on the 9th of Av in 1942. That means the Warsaw Ghetto was cleared out and Jews sent to death camps, namely Treblinka. All of those things happened on the 9th of Av. And there are actually other tragic Jewish events that have happened throughout our history, all on Tisha B'Av. And one of the most important lessons of Tisha B'Av is that when it comes to the destruction of the two temples, the reason for it is given from our sagers as sinat chinam, which literally means free hatred or hatred for no reason. But as I explained in my newsletter from this past week, that doesn't really jibe with me. Like, I really don't think there's hatred for no reason. It could be a very bad reason, but even people who are horribly anti-Semitic and hate Jews for some reason. It's an internal reason, something that they themselves are dealing with and struggling with, and it manifests in this horrible projection outwards. But there's still a reason, even if it's a messed up one. So I don't think hatred for no reason is really the best translation. I think it actually makes more sense to go back to that Hebrew word chinam, which means free or without cost. And the idea is that the destruction of the two temples happened not because of our outside enemies and what they were doing to us, but because of hatred amongst ourselves without being aware of the cost of our hatred. Hating has a consequence. And when you hate without any recognition of what the consequences are of hating, you can and will suffer. That is the lesson of Tisha B'Av. And unfortunately, that is why I feel it's incredibly appropriate to have an episode recorded live today on the 9th of Av, and why the topics I'm going to talk about are more relevant than ever. Because the fact of the matter is that I've been saying this for a while. Those who've been listening to Inside Israel since, we're almost 2 years old, for the duration of that time, many times I've talked about how the greatest threat to Israel is not Iran, Hezbollah, or even Hamas, Islamic Jihad. It's the internal threat that we're facing within the country amongst ourselves. Once we can figure out who we are and what it means to be a Jewish state and how to live together as Jews in a Jewish country, the rest of the problems will be much easier to solve. But until we figure out how to live together as Jews, those outside problems will be impossible to solve. Not just hard to solve, but impossible. And we're seeing that right now. We're seeing it even today, where the minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the far-right minister and member of the Knesset, and really, I think, the most powerful person in Israel right now, because Bibi Netanyahu takes his cues from Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. These are the right-wing members of his cabinet who want to settle Gaza completely, who really see bringing back the hostages as the second priority. And without them, Netanyahu's government will fall. So they are the ones in charge. They hold all the cards. But it's created so much internal division within Israel. And just today, Itamar Ben-Gvir visited the Temple Mount and led prayers, Jewish prayers for Tisha B'Av on the Temple Mount, right next to the Dome of the Rock. This not only goes against official Israeli policy, even worse is it throws fuel on the fire of this already very tense situation. It's just goading our Arab population into hating us at all if they don't already, or hating us more if they already do. It therefore endangers the lives of Israeli civilians. It certainly endangers the lives of Israeli soldiers serving in the West Bank and in Gaza. And it's causing even more internal division within Israel. So that wasn't even part of my episode outline that I was putting together a few days ago. This is just something that happened today. And yet it's probably the best example of sinat chinam, this hatred amongst ourselves that we have within Israeli society. When a far right minister goes to the Temple Mount, by the way, a far right minister who he himself did not serve in the army because he was seen as unfit. He failed the psychological tests to serve in the army. He was deemed too dangerous and too radical. And his own children do not serve in the army. And yet, here he is going to the Temple Mount and stirring the pot and igniting the flames in this already very tense country. It's causing so many more divisions among us. And really, it's forcing us to take our eye off the ball in terms of fighting our external enemies. So that's what I want to talk about today is these internal threats. And some of them you may recognize if you've been listening to, this podcast for the almost 2 years that we've been around. But it's always worth revisiting because as much as we ask ourselves, what should we do about Iran? What should we do about Hamas? I hate to say it, but those are really secondary questions. The first question we need to be asking is, what do we do about us? What do we do about Israeli society so that we can actually flourish? Actually, forget flourish. Survive. I would love to flourish, but before we can flourish, we need to talk about surviving as a Jewish country. And I don't use that word lightly. As I'm going to point out later on in this podcast, some of the smartest people in Israel believe, people who study sociology and trends and economics and religious movements and really the future of this country, some of the smartest people in this country believe that if we don't turn things around, we won't have a country in 30 years. 30. That we are about a generation and a half away from Israel not existing at all. And these aren't radicals. These are realists. These are the people who actually look at the numbers, look at the graphs, and see the trajectory of where this country is headed. So when I say survive, I don't use that word in a pithy way. It's very serious, and I absolutely mean it. So let's look at the biggest division, I think, the one I've talked about so many times on this podcast, and that's the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, versus everyone else in this country. As I've said before, the ultra-Orthodox do not serve right now in the IDF. Maybe a small percentage of them do, but by far the vast majority are given exemptions to continue studying in yeshiva. What we're seeing at the same time is that the soldiers who are serving are getting burned out. We had yet another suicide this past week amongst IDF soldiers. I talked about another one last week, and even those two that I mentioned, there are countless others that I have not mentioned. Soldiers are coming back from Gaza and they're taking their own lives, or soldiers in basic training, or soldiers who had to evacuate living and dead bodies on October 7th are taking their own lives. Meanwhile, the ultra Orthodox continue to not serve at all. And those of us in the rest of the population really, really resent them for it. And I've used words like parasite to describe them many times on this podcast. And on the one hand, that's part of the internal strife that I feel we need to get away from. But at the same time, I can't think of another word that's more appropriate. It's not just the army service. The ultra Orthodox, by and large, do not, at least the men, do not contribute to the workforce. So they're not paying taxes. They're not contributing to the economic base. And at the same time, they have an inordinate amount of power in the Knesset due to our political system, where it's a coalition system where you need to patch together a majority of 61 members in the 120 member parliament. And usually the party who gets the most votes in the election has about 40, 45. And so they need to find those last 16 to 20 members to create an actual majority. And who do they turn to? The extreme religious parties. The ultra Orthodox, who basically say, yeah, we'll vote with you, but no army service and yeshiva subsidies, etc. And I got to be, I got to be fair here. It's not just Netanyahu and Likud. They're in charge right now, but it's been every other prime minister as well. Lapid, when he was for a very brief time heading the when he's heading the opposition now, but for a very brief time he was set to be the next prime minister. Bennett, Gantz, who would like to be the prime minister. I mean, they've all had their dealings with the ultra Orthodox and given them what they've wanted merely to better their own political careers and keep their own power. So it's not like it's only Likud, but we're really feeling it right now when kids, 18-year-olds are having their military service time extended and reservists are going back for their 300th day plus of reserve duty while the ultra Orthodox are not serving. So that's really the main division that if you ask any Israeli, they will bring up first. Number two is the socioeconomic divide. And I've talked about that on the podcast as well. The way that it's pretty much impossible to buy living space here. I can't really say house because most Israelis don't live in houses. They live in apartments, but it's really become impossible to buy an apartment the way you used to. Even two high-tech workers on a high-tech salary, if they don't have help from their parents or some money set aside from somewhere else, it's virtually impossible to buy an apartment. The taxes are so high, and we have a great social welfare system, but that is paid for out of our salaries. And so it really is becoming difficult to afford life here for many people. I'll give you some stats. A third of Israeli children live below the poverty line. In the year 2025, in the Jewish state, a third of Israeli kids are going to bed hungry. We call Israel the startup nation, and we're damn proud of being the startup nation. But the fact is, only 10% of Israelis are employed in high tech. So this startup nation concept, it's kind of disingenuous. It represents only a small sliver of the population. And another really frightening fact that's related to that is that 20% of Israelis pay 93% of the taxes. Okay, I'll say that again. 20% of Israelis pay 93% of the taxes. And what we're seeing is a socioeconomic divide in Israel as well, where the middle class is disappearing and it's becoming harder and harder to just survive here. So that is yet another division that we're seeing. There's a lot of division between the settlers and the West Bank and more moderate Israelis who don't necessarily feel that Israel should be comprised of the entire West Bank and all of Gaza. We have Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich pushing for annexation of all of Gaza as well as of the West Bank. And it's on the table right now. Netanyahu is entertaining the idea of annexing Gaza and the West Bank. So when it comes to drawing a map of Israel, we can't even agree on what that map looks like. I mean, in the United States, say what you want about divisions within society, Democrats, Republicans, and progressives and woke and whatever. I think everyone in the US can agree where the borders are, where the border with Mexico is, where the border with Canada is. They might not feel like we're defending the borders or that maybe the borders are too fluid in the US and everyone can come in and out too freely. But at least they can say what the map looks like. In Israel, we don't even agree on what the map of our country looks like. So, how can you have a future for the country when the country itself is divided on what the borders of the country actually are? You know, I heard an amazing theory that one of the reasons Israelis as people have no borders, you know, they'll say anything to your face, they'll speak their minds, is because the country has no borders. We really do have no permanent borders. The only permanent border we have is the Mediterranean Sea to the west. Every other border we have is fluid and in flux. You know, Gaza, we're talking about annexing it. The West Bank, we have settlers living there, and it's also partly Palestinian. Lebanon, we've been in and out all the time. Egypt, Sinai used to be ours. Now it's not. Now others are talking about moving Gazans there. Everything is so fluid that we don't have these concrete borders, and that maybe psychologically that's why Israelis have no borders either. It's a very cool idea. But that's the third type of division that we have right now in Israeli society, is that those settlers in the West Bank, who, by the way, are torching Palestinian homes and vehicles and killing Palestinians almost daily. And then there's the rest of Israeli society that really finds that abhorrent, and yet we feel paralyzed. We feel we can't do anything about it. How much can we march in the streets? How much can we protest the government before sort of throwing in the towel, learned helplessness? We feel right now like the government doesn't represent us and won't listen to us. So it's exhausting. And that's another division we have, is that you have this other Israel within the West Bank, this other group of Israelis who are really, it's like the wild, wild West, and no one is holding them accountable, and it makes the rest of us sick. And then you also have the educational divide, and this relates a little bit earlier to the socioeconomic divide in Startup Nation, but you know, Israel ranks last, not third to last, not the bottom 10%. Israel ranks last among developed nations in what's called the PISA test. This is the test given to 15-year-olds during high school. And our highest scoring students on that test score below the highest scoring students from the rest of the world. There's definitely an education issue here in Israel. I've talked about it anecdotally on the podcast before. How, I don't know if I told this story, how I was talking about ninth grade advanced English with a friend of mine who lives in the States, and he was saying, yeah, that for ninth grade advanced English, his son had to memorize a portion of Hamlet, like a monologue from Hamlet, and then rewrite it in a rap style to make it rhyme, and then perform it for the class. And that's pretty cool. Ninth grade advanced English at my son's school, they watched The Little Mermaid in English without Hebrew subtitles. That was their big thing at the end of the year. So just to give you a little bit of contrast, and then I guess that's a little anecdote, but it kind of paints the big picture. Israel education is in trouble, and if we're talking about Startup Nation, well, who's going to continue this Startup Nation if there are those in a few neighborhoods who do get a good education, and then there are so many Israelis who are left behind, including Arab Israelis and Haredim, who don't even have to, by law, follow the core curriculum and learn the subjects that the rest of us do. So those are just four of the divisions that we're seeing in Israel right now. And there are real consequences for these. This is not just some cute story about, oh, this is what happened when Jews get a country of their own. It's so hard to get along. 3 Jews, 4 opinions. The future of the country is literally at stake. And like I said, some of the smartest people in Israel who study this fear that in 30 years, Israel might not exist if we don't fix these internal divisions. Personally, and I've said this before, I see real violence on the horizon between Israelis. If I told you that there are some Israelis who want to annex the West Bank and Gaza, most do not. And yet, if we were to officially declare that we're not annexing the West Bank or Gaza, or if we were to pull Israelis out of the West Bank who are living there now, I honestly believe that you could see Jew on Jew bloodshed, whether it's the assassination of leaders or violence against the soldiers and police who would be carrying out the order. And this is not a theoretical. We have seen violence by West Bank settlers against IDF soldiers within the past month. Within the past 1 month, we've seen that a few times where they literally attacked IDF soldiers physically, violently, because these soldiers were trying to prevent settlers in the West Bank from setting up outposts and from attacking Arabs in the West Bank. And so these settlers resorted to violence against IDF soldiers. So there is no question in my mind that we could actually see Jew on Jew bloodshed if it were to actually come to pulling out of the West Bank or officially declaring that Gaza annexation is off the table. And then there's the more theoretical danger of just a fractured nation without shared values or a shared vision. I'm all for a difference of opinion. And one of the beauties of Israel is struggling to figure out what it means to have a Jewish state. And is it a Jewish state or is it a state for Jews? That's a question we all should be participating in. But when we don't have a shared vision of what the country should be, and when we don't even share values, that's very dangerous. Maybe in a country like America, with the hundreds of millions of people that it has, you can tolerate some of these differences a little more because they get thinned out in the system. But with 10 million people, and 2 million of those are Arab, and over 1 million of those are Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, there's not much gemishut. There's not much flexibility there when it comes to having different values and a different vision. All it takes is a few thousand, and suddenly the scales have tipped and society can collapse. So is there hope? Because I often worry on this podcast, like, you turn in to find out about what's happening in Israel, and I tell you the reality as I see it and as those around me are living it. And so often it has been difficult. I mean, without question, these have been the 2 most difficult years in Israel's 76-year history. And I'm just going to tell you the truth as I see it. That's my mission here. But I do want to leave you with something hopeful. Is there any hope? Well, there are a few paths to hope that I see. Number one, I mentioned the ultra-Orthodox not serving in the IDF, the Haredim. This is the one issue that truly unites every other Jew in the country. So whether you're completely secular or somewhere in the middle, or a religious Zionist who wears a yarmulke, a kippah, the one issue that we all agree on is that the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim, have to start pulling their weight and contributing to this country the way the rest of us do. So what would that actually mean in practical terms? It would mean that we need to form a new political party that unites the left center and the right of center with one of their main agenda points being the conscription of the ultra Orthodox into the army and into the workforce, bringing the right and the left together into a new political party that is big enough to capture a majority and not rely on these small ultra Orthodox parties on the fringe to form a coalition. So that is one piece of hope, that this Haredi contribution to society issue is the one issue that unites the rest of us. However, the reality is that our leaders don't necessarily, in the current time, at the current time, don't necessarily have a motivation to do away with the system we have and to form new political parties. They seem to be most concerned with their own power and with the ma'arechet, the system, the structure that allows them to stay in power. We all know politicians, the first thing they care about is their own hakiseh shelahem, their own chair, right? Their own throne, staying in the position they're in. And I don't see any political leaders right now who have the cojones, the beitzim, the balls, to walk away from the system that we have and to try to start a new system where the second beneficiary might be their own political power, but the first beneficiary would be the country itself. I just don't see that happening. Another piece of hope, though, is that we have always faced obstacles as a people, even before, long before there was a state of Israel. You know, David Ben-Gurion, our first prime minister, said, in Israel, to be a realist, you must believe in miracles. And part of me has to believe that there is a miracle awaiting us right now, too, that we can't foresee it, that we don't know how it's going to pan out. But I refuse to believe that this is the end of Israel, that somehow something will change and we will figure something out. It's impossible to predict what that is. But the hope, the faith, the resilience we've always had somehow will come back and be there for us once again. Now, is it wise to bank the future of your country on miracles? Probably not. But psychologically, it's comforting. And right now, I think we need that as much as we need an actual miracle itself. I'll be back in about 30 seconds with your questions. Welcome back to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff. This week from Ra'anana, outside of Tel Aviv. This question is from a listener named Betty. She wrote, last week, I listened to your program and you said negative things about FIDF, Friends of the IDF. I was curious because I've given to this charity in the past. You mentioned you didn't see much from this organization when you were on army bases other than a bench with their placard, etc. And you are right. The funds raised could do so much more to protect the IDF. I looked it up on Charity Navigator, and they received a score of 98%. Zaka, on the other hand, and by the way, that's the organization that identifies bodies. And October 7th, they were the ones identifying bodies in the Gaza envelope, etc. Zaka, on the other hand, received a score of only 80%. Now I'm a bit confused as to best places where donations would actually go to help the important causes in Israel. What should I do? And yeah, Charity Navigator has, for years, has always given FIDF a very high score, which is why I think a lot of people were sort of blown away by all the news about Friends of the IDF. And I just want to make clear that yes, I did try to lay out the truth as I saw it about what's happening at FIDF from my unique perspective as someone who's done work with them. But I would never blame any of you for giving to them. Lord knows I've encouraged people to give to them in the past. I think when we see a nonprofit that represents the values that speak to us, and we look it up on Charity Navigator and see a score of 98%, that we feel that the homework has been done. I think now we have to start asking questions. Well, how reliable is Charity Navigator, and how deeply do they actually look at the organizations that they are rating? For example, Doctors Without Borders, I'm pretty sure gets a high score, and yet some of the Doctors Without Borders belonged to, and maybe still do, Hamas. So you can't take everything you see on Charity Navigator for granted either. I guess the lesson is that more and more we need to try to give to causes where we personally know somebody who's involved in doing the work, and we can make sure the money actually goes to where it's supposed to go. But at the end of the day, the first step is giving. And there are so many people in the world, Jews right now, who have not given anything to Israel since October 7th. I would say that those of you who have, even if it somehow got misdirected and didn't go where you were intending, like, you're in a very special category, that you care and that you are giving. And I want to tip my cap to you and make clear that in no way should blame be placed on those who are giving, because at the end of the day, there's only so much we can research and know. Here's a question from Art. He says, Egypt shares a border with Gaza. Why aren't France, the UK, and all the others flooding humanitarian aid across that border? Well, I think we are seeing a lot more aid right now come into Gaza from other countries. I think often it's being dropped in with parachutes. It's a very big question in Israel right now, the whole aid thing. We've somehow managed to avoid thinking about it here in Israel until now. But with all these photos of starving children that are appearing in the media, and then the follow-up stories where they've discovered that the photos of these children are actually photos of kids with genetic disorders and not necessarily kids who look like this because they are starving. This is now an issue that we are not ignoring. We're not able to ignore anymore. Now, I must say, the average Israeli is not wringing his or her hands over what's happening to the civilian population in Gaza. That does not mean that we are happy with it. But to us, the narrative, the majority of us, the narrative is so clear. There are hostages being held in Gaza. Just release those hostages and the borders will open and food will pour in. So we're a little bit befuddled as to why the world is demanding aid from Israel and not demanding that Hamas simply release the remaining hostages, 20 living, 30 dead at last count. Why is the world not demanding that? And so we Israelis, as horrific as the pictures are, it's not turning our stomachs the way it is probably to the rest of the world, because we live in a different context. We know that we are aware that there are still hostages being held there. And just yesterday, 2 videos came out. I don't know if this made the media in the US, but 2 videos came out of 2 of the hostages. And they look like, literally, they look like living skeletons. One of them is being forced to dig what he believes is his own grave. And this is on film. And so when we see that, it's very hard for us to fret and worry about starving Gazans. This is not to say that we don't believe it's happening, that it's false, but it's not front of mind. This war was started by Hamas. We had a ceasefire with Hamas. Everyone who wants a ceasefire now, we had one on October 6th. Hamas broke it. Why are now we being called to task to provide aid when all Hamas has to do is release the hostages, and then aid will flood in, and the people will be fed. To us, it's a different story. Our next live broadcast is going to happen next Sunday. That's August 10th, once again, at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. You can learn more about this podcast, my upcoming fall tour, my book, Israel 201, all of that at www.joelchasnoff.com. That's also where you can send your questions. Please do so. Until next time, thank you for joining the Hitraot.